Hello, everyone, and welcome to On Disability, Writing, and Representation, a roundtable discussion featuring a few of the editors and contributors of In Between Spaces, an anthology of disabled writers, the first anthology forthcoming from Stillhouse Press on November 1st, 2022. Founded in 2014, Stillhouse Press is a student and alumni-run small press operated in conjunction with the BFA and MFA programs in creative writing at George Mason University, Watershed Lit Center for Literary Engagement and Publishing Practice, and the Fall for the Book Literary Festival. In Between Spaces brings together poetry and prose from 33 authors writing from a wide spectrum of disability, including but not limited to physical disabilities, visual impairment, hearing loss and deafness, neurodivergence, and mental and chronic illnesses. My name is Rebecca Burke. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the lead editor of In Between Spaces. I am joined tonight by 3 of my fellow editors and 4 of our contributors. On behalf of myself and my fellow panelists, I want to thank you all for joining us this evening and hope you enjoy our discussion on the importance of inclusive representation in media and the contribution of In Between Spaces to this larger conversation. At this time, I am pleased to hand it over to my assistant editor, Amanda, to introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Amanda Ganus. I'm the assistant editor on this project as well as the nonfiction editor. My pronouns are she, her, and I am so excited to get to speak with everybody tonight.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa DeRochers-Short, and I'm the poetry editor, and my pronouns are she, her.
Hi, I'm Natalie Plahuta. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I was one of the nonfiction editors on this project.
Hi, I'm Teresa Milbrodt. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I was one of the fiction and creative nonfiction contributors to the anthology.
Hi, I am Dorris, and I was lucky enough to be one of the contributors to Send Some Poetry, so I'm super excited to be here.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kaleigh O'Keefe. I use they, them pronouns, and I had 2 poems selected to be a part of the collection, and happy to be here with everyone today.
Everybody bear with us for just a second as we kind of do some camera swapping with all of our contributors. I guess hopefully she'll pop on screen in just a minute. But our last contributor is Arria Deepwater, who is one of our fiction contributors for the anthology.
So I'll go ahead and ask the first question for all of our contributors and editors to answer. And that first question is, what is the first book or the most memorable book you read with disability representation? It can be representative of your disability or another.
Hi, forgot my pronouns, she, her earlier. I think for me, it's more about the lack of representation and narratives about disability growing up. It wasn't until I was in my mid-20s and I met Sheila Black that I realized, oh, wow, this is a thing. So I guess my book would be the anthology Beauty is a Verb. It's another poetry anthology edited by Sheila Black, Michael Northern, and Jennifer Bartlett.
Amanda, I think you're muted.
Thank you, Natalie. I think for myself, the first book that I ever experienced that had any kind of disability representation was actually Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief, which is something that I don't know that I thought about at the time. It's mentioned, of course, but I didn't really know how to conceptualize what that meant when I was like 12. And so now I've repurchased all of those books and intend on kind of going through them whenever I have the chance.
I'm sure it's not the first book I read with disabled characters, but the one that vividly stands out in my memory is John Green's The Fault in Our Stars, partly because I was exactly the right age to be swept up in the hype surrounding the book before its release, because I was in high school at the time, and mostly because it is the only novel I can think of that I read growing up that included a character with a prosthetic eye like mine, and particularly a character where the portrayal of his vision loss closely mirrored my own, despite us both having wildly different conditions resulting in our vision loss. The book also contains an entire cast of characters with various forms of and disabilities. It's the first time I can recall reading a book that normalized disability and illness in such a way. I remember being so excited when my classmates read the book with as much interest as I did, because for once, we were having conversations about the very things that impacted my everyday experiences, things that had never been considered by them before. It was quite literally revolutionary to my development as a young reader and writer, and as someone who considers himself disabled.
So as I was reflecting on this question and digging back to being a really little kid, the two things that came to mind that were probably even my parents' storybooks were A Christmas Carol with Tiny Tim, and also Heidi with Clara. Thank you for rolling your eyes. And also Heidi with Clara, who is a young girl who is a wheelchair user, and then by the end of the story ends up walking. And so I believe it is Sharon Snyder and David Mitchell, two disability studies theorists, in their book Narrative Prosthesis, who are talking about disability as a character trait in literature, and how for the longest time it was seen as like a negative social ill that has to either be cured or taken out of society. And so, but I believe it's part of their thesis that disability represents all that is evil or wrong with society. So generally disabled characters either have to end up cured or dead by the end. And so with Christmas Carol and Heidi, you have one of each. But in either instance, disability is taken out of the picture. And so I think that, as has been suggested, there just has not been that much positive representation of disability identity in literature until, maybe just a couple decades ago. And we're starting to get more into the Crip-Lit movement. So just very happy to be part of that and this anthology.
actually sort of piggybacking off of the classic literature of that, my first experience with disability in literature, it was read to me. My older sister and I were obsessed with Muppet Treasure Island as kids. So my mom read Treasure Island to us by Robert Louis Stevenson. And Long John Silver doesn't have a leg. So he's, going around with one leg and a crutch. And I actually reread Treasure Island this past summer and was very interested to find that he actually has accommodations on the ship. And Robert Louis Stevenson writes about how Long John has all these ropes put up on the ship so that he can swing around and get around the ship more easily. And by the end of the book, it was the first time for me, like even as a child, that I found myself liking or being having a villain be so charismatic that I actually kind of liked the villain, and that didn't happen to me a lot. As a child, I didn't really like villains, as a kid, and you're very black and white thinking, and but I liked Long John, and rereading it, I still liked Long John, and he kind of gets away with at least a little bit of the treasure at the end, and doesn't end up dying. So it was interesting to read that Robert Louis Stevenson kind of subverted that really early on, and that he had accommodations on this ship. So it was an interesting thing to read that, and to just read Treasure Island again and have that experience.
I'm realizing probably the first, after someone else said it, is Christmas Carol, but that's not what I originally thought of. Yeah, that's a interesting thing I got to think about now. I actually played Tiny Tim when I was 5 years old, so got to unpack that. But what the answer I wrote down was Freak the Mighty by Rodman Philbrick. When I first read it, I must have been between 10 and 12 years old. I really loved it. I was looking through the synopsis, getting ready for this, trying to remember it. And I do still love so many things about it. There's two main characters, that one has mental disabilities and one has physical disabilities, and they have a beautiful friendship, and they go on all kinds of adventures. And also, there's representation of domestic violence in the story too, which was something I was experiencing in my home at the time. So I think it was important to me for that reason. In hindsight, though, one of the main characters does, spoiler alert, dies at the end. But I mean, we all know about disability literature, I guess, especially from the 90s and before. But still, that story did stand out to me. Might pick it up again, give it a reread. But I also just have to shout out more recently, some stories that I've loved have been Monstrous, which is a graphic novel series by Marjorie Liu and Sana Takeda, and Black Sun Between Earth and Sky by Rebecca Roanhorse. Both have disabled main characters. And I also love two disabled poets, Sam Rush and Torrin A. Greathouse. So write all those down and look them up.
Is it me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead, Arria. Sorry.
Hi, everyone. I'm Arria. I was having a lot of trouble with my camera earlier, but I think we got it. So my pronouns are she, they, by the way. I had forgotten completely about Heidi, so thank you for that reminder. I thought about this, and I think the first time I encountered disability in literature would have been Mary Ingalls in the Little House on the Prairies series, when she lost her sight. And of course, that was covered in the television series as well. And I was trying to remember where I encountered it first. And then I realized when I was about 10, I read a YA novel that was very much a typical coming of age story, but it was rooted inside a blindness story, a young girl who develops a degenerative eye disease. I don't remember what the diagnosis was. And she has to go through this entire process of facing all of the learning struggles involved in that and still be a normal girl. And it has been sitting in the back of my, I don't remember the title of it. It has been sitting in the back of my memory with this positive glow for all of these decades. And then I brought it forward when I was doing these questions, and I realized that the entire story is deeply embedded in the ableist trope that your only real disability is a bad attitude. And it's very much telling the story of how everything is there for you. All of the supports, all of everything that you need is right there, as long as you're willing to access it and reach a level of normalcy. And so it went from being this sort of fondly remembered story to, oh, that sucks. So that was that. Again, I don't remember the name of it, but in terms of a full novel with a main character and an arc, that's what it was. And it made sense to me at the age of 10. And again, I'm a child of the 70s and 80s. So there really weren't very many depictions of disability at all. And I was thinking about it, blindness and a form of paralysis that had you wheelchair bound were pretty much the two go-tos. It was a very uncomplicated story in either case. And it not great.
Yeah, such great answers from everyone. I also completely forgot about Tiny Tim and the Christmas Carol. I really struggled with thinking of an answer to this question because I kept thinking of characters and then realizing that they're from like animated television shows. So I unfortunately think I was in high school before I read a work of literature, like actively read a book with a disabled character in it. And that was Of Mice and Men, which also horribly fulfills the trope of killing off the mentally disabled character in the book. And sadly, I don't think my high school teachers addressed like the actual reality of having a disability at the time when Steinbeck was writing, or like kill off the characters. And I think even now the book is a great example of like the lack of understanding in like American culture between like the general public and those with disabilities. And I think it's something that we need to strive to overcome.
Wonderful. And we got a question in the chat about what the book titles were. So everybody, if you wouldn't mind just kind of dropping in the chat the books that you mentioned, because I know we just got a lot of books listed all at once. I'll give it to you, Lisa.
All right. So the next question is, at what point did you know that you wanted to pursue writing?
Me again. I'm unmuted. You can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. It's one of my earliest memories that I wanted to be a writer from the age of 5 or 6. It was there, and I blame Nancy Drew entirely for that. It was, problematic with the sort of very clear focus on white middle class heteronormativity, obviously, but it was girl centered. There were different girls depicted, and they were all valuable and interesting. And the prose were put together with these descriptive sentences that were kind of complicated and used words like bucolic And I think those books really gave me a love for words and how they could be put together. And it really is one of my earliest memories of wanting to be a writer.
Thank you. I am second again in this list. You know, I think like a lot of writers, I have the story of I was writing since I was a little kid, and you know, I wrote my first story when I was like 8 and made my mom edit it with a red pen. And so that was always kind of part of my life. But the actual pursuit, I was a psychology major my first year of college. And I decided to take a creative writing class. And I think I got 3 weeks into it and was speaking with the English advisor to add a major in English. And so that was what really kind of got me on the path to thinking like, oh, I can actually pursue this as a real thing, maybe as a career, maybe just as a really exciting hobby that I can really learn more about and dig into, which was really exciting. And then I guess look where it's gotten me up to this point. And who knows where we'll go from there.
Let's see. I think as many others have said, started when I was really young, like 5. I was dictating stories to my dad, something like that. But then I ended up having a real love-hate relationship to it too when I was a little kid. I think it was something about like the physical act of writing. I don't know, just like with a pencil. Because I remember also telling my teachers, like, nope, I don't want to write. I would rather draw or something like that. And that was in sort of my elementary school years. But then later, I think junior high and high school, I really just got into it and started filling up all of the journals. But I think I did want to major in creative writing, but it was really when I was majoring in it in college that I actually started thinking about the MFA, because I'd been thinking about it as like, oh, okay, like I can get a BFA, but I need to also have another major in something that's more practical. But that was the first time I thought, okay, maybe I can make this a little bit more than just something that I'm doing on the downtime. I can actually, pursue this career-wise.
I think the idea of writing first intrigued and excited me in 6th grade. I took a creative writing class at my middle school, and it was not serious at all. The teacher kind of just wanted us to write, didn't care what it was about, didn't give us a page expectation or anything. But I thought that was a lot of fun to like invent my own stories and characters, but I never really thought about writing as a career seriously until 12th grade of high school. I had until that point been thinking I would go to medical school, and then I took chemistry classes and realized very quickly that was not realistic, and really thought deeply about what I wanted to do with the future, and realized my English classes were really the only classes I was enjoying at the time. So I think that's when I kind of switched gears and really focused on being a writer.
I My father was a high school English teacher, so I was just raised around a lot of books. I remember holding like all sorts of picture books. I love reading picture books as a very little kid, and like thinking like I'm gonna do that one day. I haven't, but maybe one day I will. But first thing I wanted to do was do like picture books, or I thought I'd be a novelist. Spoiler, haven't done that either. But I got into writing poetry when I was about 18 years old. I had like, written just like angsty teenager poems before, but they weren't like, serious poems. Or maybe they were serious for me then, but really started, focusing on the craft of writing and stuff when I was 18, and I started going out to open mics in the Boston area and going to slams. And I was so inspired by the poetry that I saw other people performing that it made me want to write. So shout outs to Lewis Morris, who was a very influential friend and poet during that time in my life, and me seeing a flyer for an open mic just hanging up in a library. I have not studied it and only started submitting my work since the pandemic. So this is also relatively new for me. But yeah, love it. Hope to keep writing. I also do journalism now as well, volunteer journalism, and I think poetry led me to that as well.
Okay, well, first off, Kaleigh, I'm so glad you submitted your work because I love your poetry and I'm really glad we get to include it. I also have a very stereotypical, I was a little kid who didn't want to do journal writing prompts in like third grade, and my mom tried to give me prompts to write about, and I liked horses, so she told me to write about, like, think of a horse and write about a horse, and I ended up writing like the 8-year-old equivalent of a novel. And decided at that point I was going to write novels for the rest of my life, and was very serious about that throughout middle school and high school, but had no idea what I was doing or what that meant. And I was fortunate enough to go to a high school that had creative writing classes. And I just loved every minute that I got to spend in that classroom, in our computer lab, working on writing, talking to my friends about writing, talking to my teacher about writing. My teacher for those 2 years I was in creative writing classes, Kathleen Mathis, was incomparable and was certainly a reason I returned to writing in college, because I listened to my parents and got my undergraduate degree in something practical, political science, because I don't do real science, and that I hated it. So my senior year of college, I knew I had to graduate with my degree that I was committed to pursuing. But I had already decided I was going to get a master's degree in something, and it wasn't going to be political science. So I reached out to the then MFA director of creative writing at Mason, Bill Miller, and set up meetings with him that turned into a incredible mentor-mentee relationship. He was kind enough to spend long hours in his office with me, working through revision notes and talking through story ideas, and really made me feel like all the thoughts that spin around in my head all day, especially those thoughts on feminism, intersectionality, and equity in the literary community and the broader publishing landscape, were worth writing down and sharing. And I never would have pursued this without that encouragement. I don't think I ever would have pursued writing or editing, for that matter, which is something I love more than writing, and I didn't know I could in the ways I have if it weren't for both Bill and Kathleen. And I cannot say thank you enough to both of them for the time and attention and kindness they've shown me over the last 10 years.
Yeah, I'm still stuck on the last question. As soon as someone mentioned Of Mice and Men, I was like, yes, I read that in high school. And yes, poor Lenny. I remember thinking how lovely and tragic that ending was. And of course, now I realize it's very problematic. And no, Star Wars doesn't count. But I remember reading Frankenstein, which is one of my all-time favorites in college again, because Frankenstein's monster is just pursued and dehumanized to such a degree for no apparent reason. Spoiler alert. Yeah, and yes, I love touring Great House, and yes, I grew up reading Nancy Drew books. There's so many connections that I really want to like thumbs up to everybody, but I can't. But how did I come to poetry? I wrote really bad teen poetry, angsty. Oh, when am I gonna find love? Oh, my heart is broken. Embarrassingly, I used to print stuff out and give poems and frames to family members as gifts. I cringe now. I really hope those have been burned to a crisp at this point. But I was really late to actually writing. I got my degree in psychology, and I decided last minute, after I'd already been accepted to grad school for psychology, that I didn't want to do that. As 22, I was quiet and introverted, and I don't think I had the skills. So I'd already been admitted to graduate school at UNT, University of North Texas. So I decided I'm just going to take some grad classes and see what happens. So I took a lit class, a fiction workshop, and a poetry workshop. And I didn't know what I was doing. I had never had a creative writing workshop. I had an English minor, but it's just because I like to read. And the lovely and wonderful poet Bruce Bond was my professor. And he was so kind and so generous. And even though I was writing really shitty poetry, because I didn't actually read existing poetry at that point, he encouraged me. And he's the reason I'm a poet. He didn't say, oh my goodness, Kara, how can you be a working poet and not read poetry? And he introduced me to Laura Kaczynski, and I guess I never really looked back. I got my MFA and then, a PhD in poetry, and now I get to teach it. So.
Okay, and then how I came to writing is, how a lot of other people did, really young. My second grade teacher, Mrs. Otterson, actually did a poetry unit with us. And that was the first time that, a teacher presented a poem to us in any kind of like serious capacity. And I was just blown away by that. And she gave us Shel Silverstein. And then a little bit later in the year, she did haiku. And the fact that she did more than one poetry unit in a second grade classroom, really changed my life and made me think like, wow, you can do this with words. Like, it's great that you can do novels and picture books and all those kinds of things, but to write about feelings in nature in such a way really blew my mind as a little child. And it really opened my eyes to what words can do really young. And I didn't really entertain it as an idea. It was more like a dream for a long time. It wasn't a serious dream until college. And I was an English major, but I was thinking about doing business writing rather than creative writing. But then the time came to actually make that decision of which track are you going to pick. And I picked creative writing and did poetry because I took a workshop with a really great teacher, Jennifer Moxley. And I loved her work, and her workshop was really great. I took it twice. And the second time that I took it, it was a class of me and my friends. And we ended up setting up a Thursday night poetry night afterwards. And we would go to different friends' houses and just party pretty much on Thursday nights and read poems and essentially what I'd like to say, howl at the moon. So, yeah. And then from Jennifer Moxley's encouragement, I knew I wanted to take a few years off of school. I knew I didn't really want to be in school immediately after graduating. And I took a few years off and then knew I wanted to pursue an MFA. And that's how I ended up coming to George Mason and doing their poetry program. And meeting a lot of you lovely people. And yeah, it's been great. Love poetry.
I have our next question, which is going to be a little different. We're going to divide this into 2 parts. And the first one is going to be directed to our contributors. So for our contributors, what did the experience of having this opportunity to submit to and be published in a disability-specific publication mean to you?
So I have read some other anthologies of disability literature. I think in particular one that was brought up before, Beauty's a Verb, really, really good anthology of disability poetry. But I was really pleased about the opportunity for this anthology because I knew that it was going to be extremely multifaceted in examining disability experiences. And it has, as has been mentioned before, in earlier published literature, particularly before the 2000s, it was more just like, blindness or like being a wheelchair user and some form of mobility disability like that. And I knew that this was going to embrace just like a wider range of disability experience, but then also the very multifaceted nature of disability experiences. Aspects of humor, aspects of crip joy, and aspects of disability culture, in addition to things having to do with both cultural barriers, physical barriers, and stigma. And so I think whenever you're putting together an anthology, it's important to just really think about that whole range. There's not just one disability experience. It is many, many, many. So yeah, that's happy to be a part of that much, much more larger picture.
So inspired by this conversation, I'm like totally going off script in my notes. Yeah, I said, I just turned 30 this year. But I've been writing in some capacity most of my life, and I've also been disabled most of my life, but only the past few years did I finally get a diagnosis for at least one of my disabilities, endometriosis, which, if you are familiar with, many people suffer for decades sometimes before they get diagnosed with it. So I was diagnosed in late 2020 after having surgery, which one of the poems in the collection is about that surgery. I started writing it before I had surgery, just trying to get down all my thoughts about what could possibly come out of this. And I finished it after I came out and actually had my diagnosis. And I started submitting my work. I've been writing for a long time, but I started submitting my work a bit after that, after I had recovered somewhat from that surgery, which was very, very difficult. So I think it's really special to be in this publication for the reasons that were said already. Exciting to be among others like you, although different in certain ways. And yeah, especially as somebody with an invisible disability that I wasn't sure if I had, and didn't even know what it was for a very long time. It's very special and validating and important, I feel, to be a part of this project. So I hope that if I had read more from people who suffered like I have, and maybe it would have helped me find my diagnosis earlier. I hope maybe this book can help somebody else do that, or at the very least, help them feel less alone.
Definitely. I don't know what else I can add that my fellow contributors haven't said. I too was born with a hereditary bone disorder, and in the 80s and the 90s, no one was talking about disability really. And so I didn't know everyone didn't have, benign tumors at various parts in their bodies. And so it wasn't until other kids were like, oh, gross, what's that? You're weird. I started to internalize the shame that comes with disability. And so I've kind of finally hit my late 30s, early 40s, and I'm capable of talking about it in a way that I never was. And I too believe that if I had been exposed to more disability ideals and characters and writers, then it wouldn't have taken me so long to acknowledge and be able to talk about it. So yeah, I make it my mission when I teach because I'm very introverted. So teaching is pretty much the way I interact with the world. I theme most of my classes around disability studies, and I always include disability authors and writers and experiences. And it's my way of trying to destigmatize and make everyone aware that we should talk about this and that disability isn't a bad word and nothing to be ashamed of, and just create awareness. And that's what this anthology does. And that is why I'm super excited to be a part of it.
Arria is connecting real quick, but just tagging on to what Kara was saying about teaching disability studies in her classes, we did have a question from an audience member asking about other recommendations for books written by disabled authors. And I hope we have some time to chat about that. But if anybody, contributors, editors, audience members, has anything that you want to throw in the chat as examples of some good disability representation, please stick it in there. I think we could all use more recommendations.
It's such a great question. I'm going to sit here with the gears turning in my brain trying to think of some, because I've read a ton, but now I need to spit them back out for someone else.
While Arria is connecting, I'm going to go ahead and bring some editors in, Rebecca.
Okay, I've had to load my camera up like 3 or 4 times now, but I did it. This question is very personal for me, and I think it's an excellent one. That's why I included it in the conversation I recorded with Tessa and Kara and Jess Skylison the other day. And I've realized that I've had a chance to reflect on it even more for myself. I grew up with myalgic encephalomyelitis, which is an invisible disability that defies diagnosis sometimes. It's very difficult to diagnose, impossible to track. And I've realized that it really exists almost more as story than anything else. It really only exists based on my ability to experience it, talk about it, and then have someone else validate it. And so growing up and through my adulthood, it has been invalidated and questioned and doubted in every way possible. And my journey to actually having a writing practice, I talked about wanting to be a writer from the time I was about 5 or 6, but the regular writing practice did not develop until even just a few years ago in my late 40s, when every single narrative about what it means to be an adult from an ableist, individualist, capitalist, supremacist perspective was burnt off. And when I really began to work on my writing, I wanted to find a way to become a part of a disabled anthology, really for the validation. And I have no shame in saying I'm seeking validation, because it's not coming from a desperate, wounded place. It's coming from a place of imagination and creativity, and the best of how human beings can see each other and acknowledge and celebrate and come together as community in validation. And so I saw the call to submit, and I submitted a story that I don't know, I haven't 100% figured all this out yet, but I think I might be one of the only contributors in the anthology that hasn't really written about my disability experience itself. It's a creative fiction narrative that it is an allegory of my experience and what I think is called for in society, but it is not directly about my disability or chronic illness experience at all, which I think adds another layer of beautiful belonging to my journey with this anthology, because it's like, you know, here I am saying, I don't know if this belongs here. And, you know, Rebecca and all of you editors out there said, oh yes, it really does. We like it. Come on in. And it's this lovely belonging. Belonging is a word that it just keeps singing through my heart as I'm speaking. So it means a lot to me. It's a very meaning making thing that I am included in this anthology. My work is included. And so thank you so much, Rebecca, and all of the editors, all of you. You just, you know, thank you.
I was going to talk about this later, but Arria, I love your piece. I love it so much. Every time I read it, I love it more. So I am so glad that you submitted to us and that we get to include it, because I think I find something new in Undertow, your short story, every time I read it. And I love that about fiction. It's one of my favorite things about fiction, is being able to come back to a story and find something new in it every time. Okay, so the other half of this question is for our editors, most of whom I asked very nicely to work on this project with me, and some of whom volunteered. So what did the experience of working on this anthology mean to you?
So it was a very personal experience for me, you know, seeing my own struggles with mental illness reflected back to me in other people's words through their submissions. And it was a really beautiful experience to get to see that and participate in that, and to also learn about new perspectives and throughout the submissions, and be able to think about how to incorporate all these new perspectives and experiences of all these dynamic people within this anthology. And for me, as the poetry editor, I was constantly thinking about ways in which we could incorporate awareness of different disabilities, sure, but also I always kept joy and humor in the background of my mind, because trauma and grief and struggle is very important, and those things are important, and we got a lot of those submissions, and we're going to, and I knew that we would, but I really wanted to make sure that we could also incorporate other elements and other dynamics as well, like dreams and you know, hopes and ambitions of people, because, you know, we're people, we have shades to us, we have all colors of the rainbow, you know. So to me, that was really a beautiful experience and really important to me. And since this all happened during the pandemic, I was also, you know, that was so at the forefront of everything for me. So I was kind of confronted by my own ableism, and made sure that I was checking in with myself a lot, and how am I coping, and am I okay? And like, am I taking enough breaks, and just making sure that I'm okay, and I'm also experiencing these moments of joy and peace while also grieving, like, because that grief is at such a very vocal and very prominent level, like on a daily basis throughout the pandemic, throughout this whole experience. So yeah, it's been turbulent but beautiful, I think. It's the way that I would phrase it.
Yeah. I think initially when I applied to work on this project, I really was just interested in amplifying marginalized and underrepresented voices, and found that really exciting and meaningful. But I think as I continued to work on it, at the time when I was helping to edit the nonfiction pieces, I was struggling with agoraphobia and would go weeks at a time without leaving my apartment. And I think reading about the different experiences and struggles of each of the very talented authors included in this anthology just helped me realize that I needed to get help. Like, it's not healthy to never leave your apartment, and helped me feel less ashamed about seeking help for my agoraphobia. So I think even though I wasn't meeting the authors, obviously, I think there was a sense of community there that helped me feel more comfortable in my own experiences.
Yeah, echoing Natalie, I definitely felt community, and felt that kind of grow as we continued to work on this project, like through the submissions process, but also the very intensive editing process, and Rebecca and I sitting in a room for an entire day trying to figure out what order these things should go in. And kind of near the end of this process that has not ended, I was seeking diagnosis for some mental illnesses and stuff. And in seeking diagnosis and getting diagnosed, I ended up with depression, anxiety, ADHD, and autism all in one fell swoop. It was comforting in a way to be able to then go back to this book that we were continuing to work on, and these voices that I had been with for so long, and these people that I kind of feel like I knew, even though I haven't met most of them. And so, yeah, just, I guess community is the thing that I always come back to when I think of how important and how significant work on this book has been.
That is essentially what my scripted answer says. I've already written like 6,000 words about this, so I was determined to keep this short. More than anything, I'm just grateful. I'm grateful, and this book just means the absolute world to me, as it's something I could have only dreamed of doing 5 years ago when I was applying to MFA programs for the first time. And I did not get into any MFA programs the first time I applied, which meant I had to sit back and reevaluate what I wanted to do and what I thought I needed to do to find myself working in publishing at some point, because I knew that's what I wanted by that point. And at that time, I had this vague, strong desire to just edit books, but I didn't know what that meant or what it entailed or like how to even go about that. And like so many other things in my life, I've just been very fortunate to be involved, or to have had the opportunities to be involved at Stillhouse. And I'm grateful more than anything for those opportunities I was lucky enough to have. And I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to read submissions from so many incredible writers for this project and to bring a selection of those pieces together in print. I'm grateful for the words of every writer featured in these pages And I'm grateful for the hard work of every single one of our readers and editors and Stillhouse staff members who spent time bringing this collection to print. And as everyone else has said, I'm so grateful for the community I've found among our contributors, for the friends I've made. Because at this point, we've spent 2 years working on a book together, and I really do consider all of you friends more than anything. And for the writing careers I now get to cheer on, because I will be, as I am, your most vocal and annoying supporter. I've just embraced that side of my personality at this point in my life. I'm proud to say that we've brought together a collection of work that is inclusive of various disabilities and experiences. And I'm excited because in many ways, this collection is just a starting point. I'm so excited to see what projects may be next for us at Stillhouse and for all of our contributors going forward.
All right, I have our next question. So I'd like to ask everybody to briefly discuss one piece in the anthology that spoke to you, and share just a couple of specifics of the craft or the content that really resonated with you as you read. And just so the audience knows, we did ask our contributors to select a piece outside of their own, as much as we love their work and love to hear them talk about their work. We want to hear kind of about some of the others of the 33 people represented in this collection. So go ahead, Kaleigh.
Thank you. Yeah, if you want to read my poems, you gotta get the book. So get the book. If you haven't got the book, what are you doing? I chose the poem At Central State Hospital, Virginia by Colleen Abel. I will not lie, I have not read the entire collection yet because I've been waiting for my physical copy. I can highlight it, put in my little sticky notes, do my thing that I do. But I was flipping through looking for something that stood out to me for this earlier this week. And once I found this poem, I probably read it a dozen times over. So I'm just going to read a small excerpt from it and then say a few words, and then you can hear from other people. So just 2 stanzas from this. My own body still in bloomers and sailor suits, and now I knew, secret keeper of the ram's head, horns snug fit to hips, bulbed at their ends like bowls of cotton. Later, when my mind went sideways, the nurses brought me chloroform in the white room. As my sight bled, I heard them murmur to each other, unfit, unfit. I think the imagery in this poem is so powerful. Read the whole thing. That's only a small part of it. And also the topic is so important, and so many people do not know or do not know enough about the history of forced sterilizations in our country and outside of our country because of colonialism. Many people, especially Black women and Puerto Rican women and people with disabilities, mental and physical disabilities, historically and still today, are sterilized against their will for eugenics and other awful reasons. So damn, sorry, started off with a bummer one after we're talking about all the funny work in this collection. Not all of it's funny, clearly. And I hope you read this whole poem and read this whole collection and learn more about the history of forced sterilizations. Thanks.
I'm going to cheat, but I'm allowed to cheat because I edited the book. I want to mention both of Cynthia Romanowski's short pieces. We accepted 2 short fiction pieces from Cynthia, one is titled WrestleMania and one is titled Live Action Regret. And both pieces battle, or not battle, but like the central tension at the core of both pieces is the narrator's struggle with specifically mania, but bipolar disorder. And similar to Amanda, throughout the process of editing this book, I decided I needed to go to doctors and find out why my brain doesn't work the way I want it to. And came away from that with PTSD and bipolar 2 diagnoses that I was sort of expecting and sort of not expecting at the same time. And again, like so many people do, my instinct was to turn to books and writing to find community. And it was really hard to find the kinds of things I wanted to read, which was lighthearted fiction that would make me feel better about myself. And I can't say either of these pieces are necessarily lighthearted, but they certainly cut to the quick of what I was struggling with in the moment. And again, just got to that sense of community. And both pieces are incredibly short. I can't remember if they, technically speaking, fall into the definition of flash fiction, but they are both extremely short. And in a very short amount of space, Cynthia is able to capture exactly what I know I have been struggling with for years. And I'm sure millions of other people have as well and may not even know it. And just on a craft level, the ability to do that in 1,000 words or less requires intense attention to detail and to word choice that you often learn from reading poetry. And I don't have those skills. I don't write a lot of short things. So I am always, always amazed by people who have that ability and have learned those skills and then are able to put them on paper to great success. And I think both of Cynthia's pieces accomplish that. And like Kaleigh, I highly recommend you go and read them by pre-ordering the book because they're great.
All right, I was going to talk about Cynthia's story. I absolutely love Live Action Regrets by Cynthia Romankowski. It's so immediate. She does this wonderful second person address that sticks you right into the middle of the action. And so you feel the emotion, the experience right along with our characters. And I love the second person address because it's when the reader talks directly to you, right? In her first paragraph alone, we have to read it. It's super short. But Live Action Regret. The new boyfriend picks you up for dinner. He is talking about his boss and you're trying to figure out how to tell him that you're crazy. That you were crazy, are crazy, and not in the wild, drunken sorority girl way, but rather in the federal government sends you checks kind of way. It's such a great pull you in moment. But I'm going to cheat too and put a second one. Becca Carson's health history is really great too, because she's got this wonderful pull and drowning. And it's about health history, of course, but it's also beyond that. So it shows the person behind quote unquote the medical diagnosis, right? And that's really important. And of course, read my poem. It's the one time I am ever going to be a pinup girl. And if you read the poem, you'll know why.
Almost could not figure out how to unmute myself. It's all good. The story that I think I keep going back to in this anthology and just reading over and over again is your very own low vision dating adventure. It's a fun read in some ways because you get to like imagine you're on this date and go through all the steps, but it's also devastating when you get to the end and even though it's kind of like you get to pick each step along the way and move through the narrative as you choose. It's still devastating when it all comes to the same result, regardless of what you pick. But I really think the author does a great job of putting you in the protagonist's shoes, and the author is Wendy Elizabeth Wallace. And she does a great job of putting you in the protagonist's shoes and really imagining like all the subtle little experiences that able-bodied people might not think of as barriers on a date that is something that the protagonist has to consider every single day and think about and plan in advance, especially if she doesn't want to disclose right away that she is going blind, and all the difficulties in like maintaining this facade as someone who can see clearly. So I really love just the dynamic structure of the story and how it's broken up based on what decisions you make moving through the date, and also just the second person that draws you in, and yet you still get all the backstory for who this protagonist is and the relationships they had before this date, and you really understand the context in which you're working through this story. So I think it's just such a creative fiction piece within the anthology, and I love reading it and taking different paths each time I read it.
Yeah. Look, I actually, never mind. Kaleigh, our very own Kaleigh O'Keefe on the call today. Prepare to have praise heaped upon you. I have chosen Kaleigh's piece, Diagnostic Laparoscopy, from the anthology, and it blew me away. Just about killed me reading it in a good way, in the best possible way. It's so short, and I love the craft of what Kaleigh has put together here. And again, go read it. But what it does is that there's an opening of an approach towards a diagnostic procedure. And what I adored about this piece is that it has this momentum leading up to the procedure, and it treats the procedure as if it's like this, or the diagnosis as if it's like this precipice. And I think so oftentimes our diagnoses are like that. There's a precipice, there's a threshold moment there. And Kaleigh's piece has this momentum, and then it drops off at the diagnosis. And what I admire, like in my bones admire, is that Kaleigh offers the reader no help after the diagnosis. It's just negative space after the diagnosis. There's no helping hand put out as a writer to say, and here's the landscape after the diagnosis. We just fall off the cliff and that's it. And it's fantastic. And I loved the lead up to, there's this imaginative, creative moment in the lead up to this diagnosis that I think puts everything in stark relief. You have this minimalist, bare bones piece with this rich creativity and imagination. You have this momentum leading up, and then this stark fall after you cross the precipice. And there is such humor and delight in it as well, that I really felt that the whole thing ended up with one of my favorite feelings, which is a sense of the absurd. And I think those of us who live in bodies that function so differently, we are perhaps most set up to harness the power of the absurd, because we live different realities. We live in a completely different reality than what is considered normal. So to be able to look at what's happening, look over there at what people think is supposed to be normal, and put things together differently is a power. It's a medicine, and I think it's got a real role. And I think Kaleigh's piece nailed it on every possible aspect. So Kaleigh, huzzah for you. And yes, I agree. Everybody go buy the book, because you got to read it. It's fantastic.
Okay, it looks like I'm live. So this is very funny because I chose the same poem also by Kaleigh, but for very different reasons. So as Arria mentioned, oh yeah, you're welcome. Let's see, but for very different reasons. And Arria was mentioning the crafting and the drop off after the end of the poem. What I liked in the build-up to the diagnosis that I thought so nicely encapsulated many different disability experiences is that there is the blood and muscle, the inflammation, the scar tissue to be expected, the scar tissue that was not expected, a box of Kleenex, and then later on 2 cups of black tea and the black hole behind my cervix. And maybe that tampon, I still don't know if I lost on the dance floor or if it got sucked up into the black hole behind my cervix 7 years ago when I got too drunk at that lesbian music festival. And so the variation in line length and the variation in the types of things that are being described, both the tangible, the intangible, the bodily, the experiential, and then all of that getting boiled down to diagnosis speaks so well to many disability experiences in terms of the things that we are experientially because of disability identity, the things that we are experientially that have nothing to do with disability identity, the physicality of disability identity in many cases, or like just with our body minds, you know, the physicality of what's maybe going on in our minds or going on with other parts of our bodies, and essentially all of these stories that we are that get totally wiped out in getting a diagnosis. And it reminded me of sitting in a doctor's office and trying to explain your whole range of disability experiences and the way that you could just like go on forever about what this disability experience is. And then it just gets boiled down to, okay, here's your diagnosis. On one level, diagnosis is helpful for getting, you know, the step that you need to go to next. And on the other hand, it feels so essentializing. And it's just like, what about the rest of me? And so that was what I really liked about that lead up to the diagnosis as well. The many facets of our intersectional identities that go along with disability identity. So yeah, read the poem. And the whole book.
I really enjoyed the poem, the galvanic skin response test, and then in parentheses, bilingual memory in American Sign Language, recollection, and English expression by Willie Conley. And, you know, obviously, I love all the poems in this collection because I, you know, selected all of them. So I like all of them. But I really enjoyed this specific one because, and I chose to discuss this one because of the physicality of the language that Willie Conley chooses to use, like long spaghetti wires to machine, connect, earphones over my head, feels same, vice, twist, pressure lock, like the repetition of all of the words of the test itself, which I had to look up when reading it, which is it's a test where they test the sweat glands and to see, like, to test your parasympathetic nervous system and like how anxious you are and like those sorts of things. And in the poem, the speaker says that they're 4 years old when they're having this test done. So imagine a 4-year-old having all of these wires and things connected to them and how, you know, visceral of an experience that would be and how terrifying, really, like a stress test like that would be, and just how physical it all would be and like a physical memory of that. And then to bring it in with the ASL makes it even more physical. And I think poetry itself can lend to the physicality of language. And I just found this poem really, really beautiful and really interesting. And I loved the repetition and thought it was just brilliant and a great read. And I think everyone should go out and buy the book.
I had the hardest time with this question, which is awful because I was the one who suggested that we ask it. But I have a whole list of pieces that I couldn't decide between because, like Lisa said, I helped select all of the nonfiction pieces and I love them all so much. And the editorial process that we went through with, developing these pieces was just wonderful. And then going through editing the rest of the pieces and placing them in order and saying what needs to sit next to what piece. It's so hard to pick something to stand out. But I think one that stuck with me in so many ways, and actually the piece that we chose to close the collection, partly because of like the very last line, is Myths of Inheritance, Cardamom by Nathan Fawaz. And that piece is just beautiful. On a sentence level, on every individual word, the themes that they're discussing, it's this piece about family and inheritance, related specifically to their great-grandmother, who they never met, but who they're imagining. And the ways that cardamom, the spice, the ways of cooking and preparing food come through, and the ways that asthma and depression and so many things have come down to them, and then things that haven't. And every time I have gone through this book, which is tons of times, and I never get sick of it, Nathan just has this way of slowing you down at the very end, gripping you the whole time. And then leaving you just kind of feeling completed. Like you can close the book and say, wow, okay, I'm happy. I'm satisfied with where this is left, which I know was something that we were always thinking about, is how do you leave a collection like this? But like you said, there's so many great ones and for so many different reasons, like everybody's discussed. So pick it up, read through it, and let us know what speaks to you. Genuinely, like every time we get to have conversations about what people are picking up from this book, it's so exciting because there's so many different things to pick up on. Okay, I'm going to bring Rebecca back on. So I'm going to be the only one on screen for a sec. So we did have a couple of audience questions that we can discuss real quick. Rebecca, I want to ask you this one specifically. This is from Josh, who said, I wanted to ask about the realm of disabilities. As you've read, have you encountered more depictions of physical disability or mental disability? Both are valid. I'm just curious which ones authors tend to lean towards.
I think that's a great question. And it's also going to, okay, I'm going to frame this in two ways. Me as a reader, I have read a lot of, I have trended towards books about like reading about mental illness and neurodivergence, partly because that's what I write. And that's what I've gravitated towards as a writer. So I've tried to read what I'm interested in writing to develop my craft in that area. As an editor, I've also read a lot, both from as an editor at Stillhouse and as an editor at So to Speak, Mason's intersectional literary magazine, that I used to be the fiction editor of when I was a student, we got a lot about mental illness, and how disabling mental illness can be, which, again, I as a person gravitate towards, which is my own personal bias. I'm aware of that, and I try to register that. That is not to say that people aren't writing about physical disability. It is just to say that in our general submissions at Stillhouse, in our submissions at So to Speak, we just weren't seeing as much of it as I personally would have liked to have seen. And to address this, we would try and change our submission calls to bring in more submissions. We would try and make sure our submission calls were going out directly to people who we thought could share perspectives on that front. And then again, more broadly speaking, as someone who works in publishing, I've seen a trend in recent years towards a much more inclusive representation of various different kinds of disabilities and experiences across genres, but largely in YA and adult rom-coms, which is amazing because both of these larger genres are incredibly popular. So seeing them as vehicles for massive change and what types of characters are getting written about means that they're actually getting read because they are wildly popular and they are shared immensely on social media sites like Instagram and TikTok, which then means that these stories are getting shared even more. So all that to say, I think things are changing. I think it depends on the genre of what you're looking at. And I know as like an editor of both a small press and a small literary magazine, I always wish we had more of both, but particularly experiences writing about physical disability in any way, whether it's from a humorous perspective or like memoir, any type of memoir, even someone just reflecting on like challenges in their lives. But again, I really do think the industry has changed last 5 years or so to be more inclusive because there's been books that are more inclusive are selling incredibly well, and the industry is going to pivot to support that because they want to make money. Publishing is at its core a capitalistic enterprise, despite how committed we are to the art and the craft of what we are putting out. Especially big publishing is immensely committed to how much money can they rake in off any book. But all that being said, I can recommend more books published in the last 5 years with good representation of whether they are mental or physical or invisible disabilities or chronic illnesses, you name it. I can recommend books off the top of my head. Of course, I can't do it now because I just can't think clearly. But if I sat down and thought about it for 10 minutes, I could name more books published in the last 5 years than I could have in the last 20. Or the 20 preceding that, I guess is what I mean, from like 1998 to 2018 or 2017-ish, which I think is a good thing. But in the grand scheme of how many books are being published a year and how many books have been published since records were kept about book statistics starting in like the 1950s, it's a small number. And I just hope that keeps changing. I hope trend-wise across the board that keeps changing in terms of diversity in general. I love seeing more diverse work in my queue at Stillhouse and on my shelves when I go to bookstores, because I don't like reading the same things over and over again. I love diverse work, but I also just really want to see, like what I talked about at the beginning, that normalization of different experiences, whatever those experiences are, so that people feel accepted and included, and so that people can turn to books or other forms of media, because books get optioned for film and TV series. Like, can't tell you how excited I am to see the Percy Jackson TV series come out, because I completely forgot about the well-written disability representation in that series and how much I loved it when I was in high school, because I didn't read them until I was in high school, but just completely blocked it out of my brain when I was thinking about that one question that I wrote for this. Anyway, I'm starting to ramble, so I'm going to make myself stop and let someone else jump in if they would like to.
I think you answered it pretty thoroughly. I know that like it was a conversation that we were having over and over again with this particular collection, was just kind of how awed we were by the variety that we got, and the ways in which we were able to see this vast spectrum of disability and lived experience, both within and outside of disability. We created at one point this massive spreadsheet that was hitting on some of the main themes and topics of every piece as part of our editorial process. And that I think had like 90 something subjects that we named, with no piece hitting less than a dozen or so of them. And it's like this big rainbow of intersectionality, really, and the ways that we saw those cross over into visible and invisible, physical and mental disabilities was really fantastic. And I need to go find, now that we're at this point in the process, I want to go find that spreadsheet again, and see how it hits now as to how it hit like a year ago when we were starting that process. We had one more question, I believe. And this is from Victoria, who asked, who is your target audience with your anthology? And is there a specific group you want to reach?
Okay. I apologize in advance if this rambles. I'm going to try and make it concise. I think people will look at, or especially people who don't identify as disabled, might look at this and say, oh, that's not for me. But that's definitely not true at all. And you shouldn't think that about writing from any marginalized group, period, end of story. You should read widely and diversely at all times, because it makes you a better reader, writer, and overall person, to experience different perspectives across the board. More specifically, I wanted, and Amanda, you can speak to this as well whenever you want to cut me off. I wanted this book to be a reflection, a collection, a celebration of what being disabled really means to each of our contributors, and to bring all of those experiences together to be a reflection, I guess is the word I want to use, of that, but then also a starting point for other conversations to spawn. This is in no way, shape, or form meant to be the end all be all. It is a sentence in a much larger conversation that is continuously ongoing. I hope that other people who are disabled will read it, because of course I do. In our marketing campaign over the last 6 months, have worked very hard to get this book into the hands of disabled readers and reviewers, because those are the people I want to make sure have copies. But I also think that anyone who has interest in good writing, regardless of who wrote it, should read this book. I think a lot, I mentioned this earlier, I think a lot about my high school creative writing teacher and how I cannot wait to send her a copy when I have the final copies in hand, in part to thank her for everything she did for me and continues to do, even though I haven't spoken to her in person in 8 years, because those relationships stick with a person. And while it's up to her to decide whether any of the pieces in the collection are appropriate for teaching in her high school class, I hope she will read it, and I hope she will share some of the work with her students, because I think some of them would really resonate with high school students. I know they would have resonated with me in high school. And that's not to say the collection is young adult by any means. It's not. It was written with an adult audience in mind and a broad adult audience in mind. But that's not to say that teenagers aren't capable of reading work like this and engaging with it, and that teenagers don't need to be reading work like this. Again, the only book that came to mind for the longest time, because now I remember Percy Jackson and Heidi and all these other books I definitely read as a kid and didn't remember. I mean, the only book I had that I look back on 10 years later and remember is John Green's The Fault in Our Stars, because of the broad representation it includes. But it was written by a cisgendered, able-bodied white man, which is incredibly problematic in its own way. And I wrote an entire essay about it, so I'm not going to rehash all my problems with it here. But like, that's all I had in high school. And if I had had a collection like this, I think I don't know what it would have done for me, because I don't have a frame of reference for it. I would have just felt so much more connected at a time where I was constantly being told I shouldn't identify as disabled because I can see, I have vision. But that's not the point, because I also can't see and I can't do a lot of things. Having 30% of vision that a normal person has doesn't negate the fact that I'm missing 70% of my vision regardless, and that there are a lot of things I can't do as a result. And just having a book where that would have been validated by other people who are also disabled, and this book features work by 4 people who are visually impaired, like just knowing 4 other people who are visually impaired would have changed my life. It did change my life in the last 2 years for the better. And for many reasons, I'm incredibly grateful for that, as I've already said. Anyway, that was my long again, I told you I was going to get off on a tangent. That was my long tangential way of saying that I don't want people to look at this and assume that this book is only for people of this marginalization. This book is meant to be read and accessed widely by anybody who's willing to interact with the content. And it really does read beautifully. We worked very hard to make sure it was accessible and flowed from start to finish.
Yeah, and I don't want to add too much, but you talking about, I don't know why this hasn't hit me before now, but you talking about needing this book when you were in high school and what it would have done for you. Thinking back to myself in high school, I had no concept of myself as disabled. So I wouldn't have identified as somebody within these pages in that sense. But imagining myself at 15 or 16 reading this book, and I read all the time, and seeing such a vast spread of voices and perspectives and experiences, I think would have been life-changing in just knowing what's out there in the world, and getting to see something outside of my high school, in rural Texas, which is where I'm from. And I feel like it would have brought so much more empathy to me so much earlier. Stuff that I was working through and learning and seeking when I was, latter half of college and grad school. I feel like I would have gotten to see some of that earlier. All of that's to say, which I think that anybody who can pick up this book and see good writing and find something out of it, and really engage with it. And it's not just about the disabled parts of everybody's lives. It's about so much more in these full lives that people are living. But yeah, this whole conversation has given me a lot more to think about, which is amazing. All right. Well, Rebecca, I think you have some closing statements for us.
I just want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank our contributors and our editors for their thoughtful contributions to this conversation. I want to thank everyone in the audience for your comments in the chat and your contributions to the discussion. I'm going to have to scroll back through and look at all the books people recommended so I can add them to my reading list. I'm very excited about that because I know I have not read half of the ones mentioned. And I hope that, Amanda mentioned that this conversation has given her a lot to think about. It's certainly given me a lot to think about. I think what I said earlier about the anthology as a whole entity being just a sentence in a larger conversation, this discussion, this event is also just a part of a much larger conversation going on in the world right now, that I hope all of you will continue to learn more about and contribute to, discussing and sharing and what's the right word? Promoting, not quite promoting, elevating the voices of marginalized people, but particularly in the context of this, people with various disabilities, and letting them have the opportunities to speak for themselves and define their own experiences. Agency is incredibly important. And I think, especially as we've said in the last 5 to 10 years, that that like embracing of agency by disabled people to define themselves and their experiences has become even more important, and should and will only continue to grow in importance going forward. I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add, Amanda, but again, thank you to everyone. Thank you for a great conversation. This was really wonderful, and I hope you all have a great rest of your evenings.